Mark Carney spent January becoming the most admired leader in the world. His Davos speech on January 20th drew a standing ovation from global leaders and business executives. NATO Secretary-General Mark Rutte said it was proof that Canada is back. Denmark's Mette Frederiksen praised it from the bottom of her heart. Finland's President Alexander Stubb called it one of the best speeches heard at Davos all week. Carney had built something rare. A global reputation as the principled leader willing to call out great power coercion and stand for a rules-based world. Then February 28th arrived. The United States and Israel launched strikes on Iran without consulting Canada. And within 72 hours, Carney shattered everything he had built. Does Carney still deserve to be leading Canada after what happened? Drop your answer in the comments right now. We want to know exactly what you think. Here is the sequence. On February 28th, Carney issued a joint statement with Foreign Affairs Minister Anita Anand declaring that Canada supports the United States acting to prevent Iran from obtaining a nuclear weapon. He called Iran the principal source of instability and terror throughout the Middle East. The statement made no mention of international law, no reference to the UN Charter, no acknowledgement that Canada had not been consulted or informed before these strikes began. Analysts immediately noted that Carney's initial response was more hawkish and more unconditionally supportive of the American offensive than virtually any other Allied leader's public position. And France's Emmanuel Macron had already warned that military action conducted outside international law risks undermining global stability. The UK and Germany had called for de-escalation. Spain's Pedro Sanchez had condemned the strikes outright. Carney went the other way entirely. The backlash came fast. Former Liberal Foreign Affairs Minister Lloyd Axworthy published an op-ed the same day comparing Carney's Iran statement unfavourably to Canada's decision in 2003 to refuse support for the American invasion of Iraq. Axworthy noted that the attack on Iran had not been authorised by the UN Security Council and that this was the seventh country against which President Trump has ordered unilateral use of force while in office. Liberal MP Will Greaves posted a video to social media the same night. Canada cannot endorse the unilateral and illegal use of military force, he said, while also insisting that our sovereignty, our rights, and our independence must be respected. Carney's own caucus was openly breaking ranks within hours of the statement's release. Here is the moment that captured how completely this was unravelling. On January 20th in Davos, Carney had stood before the world and declared that Canada would remain principled in our commitment to fundamental values, including the prohibition of the use of force except when consistent with the UN Charter. 6 weeks later, he issued a statement supporting a military offensive that he would later himself describe as appearing prima facie inconsistent with international law. The gap between those two positions is not nuance. It is collapse. 2 days after the initial statement, on March 2nd, Anand released a new statement that contradicted Carney's tone entirely. It called on all parties to prioritise the protection of civilians and civilian infrastructure, to return to negotiations, and to advance a diplomatic resolution. Observers described the experience of reading it as whiplash. Political commentator Rudyard Griffiths said Anand had been playing clean-up duty for a statement that had put Carney offside European leaders and was offside with much of the Liberal base. 3 Canadian officials had now staked out 3 different positions on the same crisis. Carney backing the strikes, Anand calling for diplomacy, Defence Minister David McGuinty calling for a ceasefire. Analysts watching from Allied capitals were not seeing strategic ambiguity, and they were seeing a government that did not know what it believed. When you watch the leader of a G7 nation contradict himself 3 times in 72 hours on the biggest international crisis of the year, you are not watching a foreign policy disagreement that stays in the realm of politics. You're watching something that lands in your life. Canada's trade credibility, its leverage in negotiations with the United States, the European partners Carney spent months cultivating at Davos and at the Munich Security Conference. All of it depends on Allied capitals believing that when Carney makes a commitment, it holds. When those capitals watch a government issue 3 contradictory positions in 72 hours, while its own caucus revolts publicly, they recalculate. Investment decisions that depend on political stability get reassessed. Trade partners who are weighing deeper ties with Canada ask whether the government they are dealing with can hold a coherent position when pressure arrives. On March 4th, Carney arrived in Australia and told reporters at a press conference that Canada could not categorically rule out participation in the military conflict and that Canada would stand by our allies when it makes sense. This was not a clarification. It was a third position added to two already irreconcilable ones. Nada Hashemi, a Canadian-born associate professor of Middle East politics at Georgetown University, told Fox News Digital, "He's been all over the place. It doesn't look very good for him or for the government of Canada." Sean Spear, co-founder of The Hub, identified the precise damage. He's made the case over the past year that he is the right person for a crisis. This is as much of a crisis as one can imagine. And on the face of it, it looks like the Prime Minister's government is failing this test so far. The credibility damage was not only domestic. European leaders had watched Carney at Davos and aligned themselves with his vision of principled middle power cooperation. They had praised his commitment to the rules-based order. They had seen him as the leader who would hold firm on international law even when pressure from Washington made that costly. Then they watched him issue a statement that placed Canada to the right of France, Germany and Spain on an illegal military offensive, only to walk it back twice in 72 hours after his own caucus rebelled. And the Asia Times described it plainly. Carney's Iran stance had failed, the first test of his Davos promise. The American Prospect wrote that Carney had punctured his January triumph with a show of support for the attack that dragged the world into yet another Middle East war. Do you think Carney could have handled this differently? Was there a version of this where he threads the needle and comes out with his credibility intact? Tell us exactly how you would have played it in the comments. The concrete consequences are already visible. The Liberal caucus that Carney did not consult before issuing his initial statement is now a source of active political instability. Liberal MPs told the Hill Times that the failure to consult was indefensible. Our internal pressure forced multiple reversals that made the government look directionless on the international stage. Canada's relationship with European partners who had invested political capital in Carney's middle power vision has been complicated by a response that put Ottawa closer to Washington's unconditional hawks than to Paris, Berlin or Madrid. The Asia Times noted directly that Carney was elected to resist American domination, not acquiesce to it, and that he had thrown his own foreign policy into disarray. The trade negotiations with the United States that Canada needs to navigate successfully, including the USMCA review with a July 2026 deadline, are now being conducted by a government whose credibility for principled consistency has been openly questioned by its own MPS, former ministers, and international observers simultaneously. What allies saw in 72 hours was this. A leader who had built his entire international brand on principled middle power leadership and commitment to international law issued the most unconditionally hawkish response of any allied leader to an illegal military offensive, then walked it back under caucus pressure, then refused to rule out military participation, then flew to Australia and Japan while his caucus held emergency calls about whether they understood what their own government believed. The sequence does not reveal a bad day. It reveals that the Davos speech and the months of diplomatic relationship building that preceded this crisis were not backed by the institutional depth, caucus alignment, or strategic coherence needed to sustain a position when an actual crisis arrived. The damage is not temporary. Every future moment where Canada tries to play the role of principled middle power broker, every future negotiation, every future moment where Canadian credibility needs to open a door will be assessed against what happened in those 72 hours. When European capitals that praised the Davos speech now watch Canada make and unmake its position 3 times in a week, while its own caucus publicly demands explanations, they file that information. When trade partners evaluating Canada as a long-term partner ask whether this government can hold coherent positions under pressure, they now have a clear data point. The standing ovation in Davos was real. The credibility collapse in the first genuine test of everything Carney promised was also real. Both of those things are now true simultaneously, and Canada has not yet provided a convincing explanation of how it recovers from the contradiction. If this video gave you something to think about, support the channel by hitting the like button and subscribing. See you in the next one.